Jim Turk. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. I've lived here all my life.
My name is Jenny Turk. I live with my husband Jim and our two sons, Sam and Nicholas. Sam is 15 and he's a sophomore in high school, and Nicholas is 11 and he's in 6th grade.
We've been married for 18 years. We actually originally met in 5th grade.
And we went to different middle schools, but we reconnected in high school and started dating our senior year. So we've actually been together about 26 years and we've been married for 18.
I was diagnosed with MS in 2008. I had symptoms, as a lot of people do. I had symptoms for a lot of years leading up to that. My diagnosis came as a real shock to me because prior to that, I was constantly burning the candle at both ends. I was extremely active and a runner and just always kind of wore that as a badge of honor.
We were a really active family. Jim was a marathoner and our family would do a lot outside and attend his events with him and do the loops with him and kind of cheer him on. And we would do a lot of biking and a lot of outdoor activities as a family.
Everything doesn't happen at the time of diagnosis. I mean, the nature of the disease is it gets progressively worse, but it became clear that I wasn't just in my head and that I wasn't, imagining it. I started trying to go for runs, and I couldn't. So I'd run for maybe 2 minutes, and I would start shaking uncontrollably, almost pee my pants because I really kind of lost all control. And then I'd find I couldn't even turn my iPod off because I had lost my fine motor skills.
He was very fatigued. He was very stressed, and a lot of the doctors thought that the fatigue was just related to stress. He was going through a master's program at the time while working full-time, and our kids were very young. So a lot of the doctors chalked everything up to stress, but the fatigue was really the main onset symptom.
So multiple sclerosis, or MS, it's essentially a disease where the immune system turns against the body and attacks the brain.
The body basically attacks the myelin, which is the insulation of nerves. Myelin allows nerves to conduct their messages fast and with precision. And if the myelin is gone, the messages don't get from A to B.
I had no idea what MS was, and so I don't know what that means. I don't know if I've got 6 months to live. I don't know if I'm going to be in a wheelchair in 6 months.
It's a very complex disease, leads to various forms of disability.
The cause of MS is really not known. It's thought that there are genetic factors that interact probably with some sort of environmental factor leading to the onset of the disease.
MS is typically diagnosed between 20 and 40 years old, but some believe that it may begin even earlier. It's just not noticed by the patient.
And it's the single most common disabling neurological disease in young adults.
It's hard to get yourself to admit that something's wrong when you think you're bulletproof. And so I was pretty nervous about that. I was pretty worked up about how my kids would remember me, how much my wife would have to take care of me, all these things, if I'd be able to keep working, all sorts of interesting things go through your head. So you're nervous every day. When you have a chronic progressive disease, you don't know what the next day is going to be like.
First, we felt very uncertain about the future. I think that's probably the best way to describe our feelings at the time.
There's just so much unknown. I think that's the biggest part of it, is everybody's afraid because you just don't know what to expect.
When you get a diagnosis like that, you tend to think the worst and think it's a death sentence immediately. And of course, the first thing we did was hit the internet and look up everything, which a lot of what's online is worst case scenarios, and it tends to instill more fear. So we were very afraid of what the future held for him and for our family.
Multiple sclerosis affects approximately 2.5 million people worldwide, and in the United States, it's estimated to be about 400,000 people. And the latest numbers show that comes to diagnosing approximately 200 new cases every week in the United States.
No one knows why it begins or why the disease continues, why it appears in multiple members of some families, but in just one person of other families. It really is a great mystery.
There seems to be a greater incidence of the disease in northern climates. In fact, if you move further from the equator, you see greater incidence of MS.
Typically, it's in individuals 20 to 40 years old. It's more prevalent in women compared to men, about a ratio of 2 to 1.
No one in particular is susceptible to getting MS, really. There are some theories that maybe vitamin D deficiency might make a person more susceptible, being exposed to certain viruses or having some particular genetic background. But really, the answer to that is unknown.
So the symptoms of MS are typically misunderstood because it's an invisible disease. Living with MS has really taught me how to live in the moment. I've learned how to live day to day instead of looking way out in the future. And that's just something I think in the nature of a progressive disease, that's what you have to do. You tend to stall out if you look way out into the future. And so I make sure to get enough sleep. I make sure to try to manage my stress levels, which have a pretty strong impact on my symptoms.
The symptoms of MS can be pretty much anything that's involved with the central nervous system. There can be changes in cognitive ability, cognitive speed, vision, motor control, sensation, bowel and bladder and swallow control.
Your ability to speak, it can be motion, difficulty walking, tingling, numbness.
Perception of the environment's temperature, just about anything, really.
My speech tends to be pretty bad. It certainly gets worse when I'm tired or eat the wrong things, but it's always a little bit of a struggle.
Oftentimes it sounds like perhaps that he's drunk if you wouldn't know who he was. His speech is slurred.
I also have a tendency to choose the words carefully that I say. I tend to try to quickly go through the thesaurus is a tough thing to say, I guess. Try to quickly go through the thesaurus in my head and come up with an alternate word that I can use.
The problem is that people are never sure whether they will develop these symptoms with time. There's a great deal of uncertainty and no way to tell exactly how a disease is going to progress.
The disease course is very unpredictable, and you could be feeling fine and then the next day have a relapse.
The prognosis for MS is quite variable. It really is a very different disease from person to person.
I have pretty bad leg problems, and certainly the strength in my legs is affected. My legs are very clearly becoming progressively weaker. I very clearly have balance issues, much worse than I used to. What I get is a chronic achiness, and so, especially in my legs. And so it's really hard for me, for example, in certain cases, to get to sleep at night because my legs ache so bad. So in terms of a walking device, I tend to use a cane. When I walk outside or any distance inside, I have to have that cane.
His balance is very, very shaky. Oftentimes, even with the cane, it's a little stiff and shaky.
Pride gets in the way of a lot of things, and so it's hard to bring yourself to use an assisted device. It's pretty hard to walk a reasonable distance, let alone run. I can't run.
He doesn't run. Even walking short distances is not possible.
What's happening in the body in people with multiple sclerosis is that at different speeds or different magnitudes, portions of the central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord, are essentially being whittled away. The myelin, the covering of the nerves, is breaking down.
Myelin is the substance that insulates the nerve fibers in the brain and spinal cord. The nerve fibers, of course, transmit electrical impulses. That's how different regions of the brain communicate with one another. That's how the brain communicates with the rest of the body.
So if you were to look into the brain or the spinal cord of a person with MS, what you would see basically is inflammation. So you would see areas that have been invaded by lymphocytes, and where there is damage, there is cell death, and there is edema. And then over time, you would also see some areas where sclerosis has occurred, basically scarring, where there was a lot of inflammation. Now it has resolved, but there's dead tissue there, and there's plaques, areas of plaques.
And then I ride a stationary bike to keep the blood flowing in my legs, and I just turn the resistance way down. And within 5 minutes, that really tends to get me back to normal, where I can at least walk up to bed.
But then also more superficial white matter. So prognosis in MS is difficult. There are different varieties of the disease, the most common being relapsing remitting, which means someone will have a flare-up and then it will quiet down, and then they'll just be stable for a while. Then there are the progressive forms of the disease, where instead of these relapses and intervening quiet periods, you just have a steady, slow, steady progression where you become increasingly more disabled. And that variability is one of the reasons that giving someone a prognosis is very difficult, because we don't quite understand the mechanisms behind the relapsing remitting form going on to become the progressive form.
The future is, I think as with anyone, it's uncertain, but I think when someone is living with a chronic illness, it's even more so.
And certainly I could wind up, in a wheelchair in 5 years or 10 years or 3 years, I don't know. I feel like that's certainly a possibility.
It's a little scary to think about what it might be like to have a spouse in a wheelchair, or someone who is very much less mobile than he is now. It's the person is living with the disease, but the family is living with the disease too.
I have relapsing remitting MS, which is the most common type of MS. It hasn't gone to one of the progressive stages at this point. I see Dr. Luzio as my main neurologist, and when I see him, I tend to get a whole battery of tests done in a short amount of time. He'll check the strength in my legs and in my arms. He'll check the sensitivity on the bottoms of my feet. He'll check my balance. And I'll walk in a straight line, and he'll see how well I'm doing that, how my gait is working. Just various kinds of balance checks, visual checks, strength checks, all that kind of thing.
And just this hand tap like that for me.
What's most important in the exam, to me, the cognitive abilities, vision, eye movements, coordination of the limbs, and walking. Jim has taken control of his multiple sclerosis, and this is what I like to see. He maximizes his exercise and he eats healthfully, and because of that, he's doing well.
All right, great.
Most of the current therapies for MS are designed to reduce the immune response.
In the past 20 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in the options, therapeutic options for people living with MS.
So there are a dozen or so medications that have been FDA approved, and either they're injected or infused, or they're taken by mouth orally, and they help and reduce the frequency and magnitude of exacerbations.
The medication I've chosen it's a biological, and I take it by injection 3 times a week.
These drugs can be quite effective. None of them are perfect. They have side effects. They're not always 100% efficacious. And none of them are effective against the later stage of the disease, progressive MS. There's nothing that's effective for these patients at that stage of the disease.
For me, it's hard to justify or come to terms with the fact that I'm not able to put in my fair share, do my fair share around the house. I can't clean. I can't do stuff like that. I live in a cold climate. I can't shovel snow. I can't mow the lawn. And that's a tough thing to take, and it's tough to justify it in your mind, but there's nothing I can do about it, so you just have to get past that.
We just have adapted to what we need to keep the household and the family functioning.
People with MS are left with permanent injury from their attacks, either from a relapse or disease progression. And these deficits impact the way they live their lives.
So it's a very key event when the loss of that myelin insulation goes on to become loss of nerve fibers. Once you lose a nerve fiber, they generally don't regenerate. But it turns out that the myelin actually does regenerate. It can regenerate. There are mechanisms for repairing damaged myelin. So that's really a major goal of investigations into new therapies. Can we reverse the damage by repairing myelin and promoting the formation of new myelin?
Developing a therapeutic that can reverse some of that, can restore some of the function that has been lost as a result of this disease, would transform lives.
Imaging in MS, and particularly magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, was a major breakthrough in the early 80s because it allowed us for the first time to visualize directly in a living person the lesions that occur in the brain as a result of MS.
The use of MRI has changed how we think about multiple sclerosis as well as how we develop drugs for multiple sclerosis.
Playing with the kids is something I can't do as much of anymore.
Before he was diagnosed with MS, we did things like we went out in the backyard and we would play football a lot.
I certainly can't run around or do a horse around with him or anything like that because I can't stand. I'll still, to a certain extent, play games, board games, things like that with them, video games. But it's certainly my ability to do that has certainly been restricted.
Having a dad with MS makes me feel a little different. I look at my friends' dads and what they can do, and then I look at my dad, and he can't do a lot of that stuff, but he's still a really good dad.
To find a treatment for MS and to promote recovery, we are obliged, or we have to test these treatments in animals prior to taking this into the clinic. And without the ability to do this, it will be impossible to find a treatment that will restore function to the nervous system.
It's not perfect, but we do have animal models that replicate quite well some aspects of the disease, and we put it all together. We look at the totality of the data from in vitro studies with isolated cells and the different animal models, and then we can make the best decision as to what to take forward into the clinic.
One good thing that has come from my dad having MS is that our family is more aware of each other, and we look out for what my dad needs and try to help him as much as we can.
But we do things around the house for him that we don't even think about, that people probably wouldn't normally have to do. Like if he drops something, we always pick it up for him because it's hard for him to bend down and get stuff. And if he's going down a hill or something, then we grab his arm or whatever so he can help him balance and stuff. But it's not that much different, than having a normal dad. So
I just consider this our lifestyle. So it was a big emotional burden for sure, but we're learning to adapt.
Before bringing drugs into people for testing, you have to make sure that it will be safe enough, that you are not going to put the patients at risk. So toxicology testing is actually a requirement of FDA and regulatory agencies. Is something that we have to do, that makes perfect sense. That you test into animals and you dose escalate up to doses that are quite high to see potentially what could happen in the patients. And then that tells you don't go forward, it's too toxic. Or it tells you, well, there are some risks, maybe with the liver or some other organ, and then you can be on the lookout for that when you do your clinical trial and make sure that you keep the patients safe.
Drumming is something that I've done my entire life. No matter what's happening, it's making me feel better. Keeps the blood flowing, it keeps the nerves firing, which is kind of what I'm going for.
There's not going to be one treatment, one pill, one infusion that fixes MS. How we approach this disease is going to be understanding who are the players in that process of disease progression, and how do we target each of those players to create an environment that brings people as close to normal as possible.
Most people working in the field now feel that a cure for MS is going to be a multifaceted approach. If you only target one aspect of the disease, you're likely to fail.
And at least the way we're thinking about it is you need to control the immune system. That's the first order of business, stop the attack. But then you would want to combine that with something that can also then repair the damage that has occurred and that is still occurring.
Right here, let's look at other.
One of my biggest hopes would be that they can come up with a effective therapy and maybe even a cure for MS.
So the brain actually has its own repair mechanisms that ultimately fail in the face of this immune attack. But if we could come at it from a two-pronged approach and on the one hand reduce the intensity of the immune attack, but then on the other hand also boost those repair mechanisms, we might be able to shift the balance of power, if you will, and if not completely eliminate, at least reduce the severity of damage to the point where someone remains symptom-free. I really firmly believe that we're going to figure this out and there will be a cure for MS. Maybe not next year, maybe not 5-10 years, but it's coming, and I would like people to know that.
I think that people with MS should be encouraged that within the next 4 to 5 years, therapies will advance through the clinic, through the various phases of clinical trials, and provide great hope for improvement and potentially restoration of function.
My greatest hope for our own research is that we will develop a drug that really makes a difference in the lives of MS patients, something that will either prevent or reverse disability and would really change their lives.
I think that as I get older, treatments will get better, therapies will get better, but I certainly am fairly optimistic that in my lifetime, things will get better and better.
The research is hopeful. It seems to take so long.
I guess what it means for me is stopping MS or slowing it down significantly.
I just hope it's timely, that people like Jim and at Jim's stage of the disease and Jim's age, and even people younger who are being diagnosed with MS are able to take advantage of some of the things that they're starting to talk about now. I think that they'll get there. I really do. I just don't know when.